So thank you all for coming. I'm honored to be the person to introduce our speaker on behalf of the Department of Psychiatry today. Before I do that, though, I just wanted to thank the Poynter Fellowship, which helped make this possible. The Poynter Fellowship was established by Nelson Poynter, who's an American publisher who graduated from Yale in 1927. And he established this fellowship to encourage journalists, prominent authors, and editors to come to Yale. So we are very grateful for their support because they helped make this possible. I also wanted to say a word about the opioid epidemic. I think that's why most of us are here. It's something we talk a lot about in our department and in our medical school. We mostly talk about it from the perspective of treating patients, treatments, maybe even public policy. We've had people standing where I am today to talk about it. But we don't really talk about how we get here and what are the social, cultural, and economic antecedents of this opioid epidemic. And as a lot of you know, because you read the book Dreamland, the author has written an outstanding chronicle of this epidemic. And I personally love this book, although I will say two words about that. It sat next to my bed for a long time, and I felt like I should read it. But it felt a little like work, and maybe I didn't really want to read it. But my colleague, Ellen Edens, was telling me how great it was, and so I finally picked it up, and then once I picked it up, I couldn't put it down. And in fact, I really loved it, and then I gave it to everybody. I gave it to my friends, I gave it to my family, including my children, and my daughter Zoe's here today. I gave it to my colleagues, and of course, we're giving it to our trainees as well. So let me introduce the author. Mr. Sam Quinones is a journalist. He graduated from UC Berkeley. He is a freelance reporter and was a former LA Times reporter. He lived for many years in Mexico and reporting on the opioid epidemic, reported on gangs, migration, and then of course this recent book is on the opioid epidemic. He's written New York Times editorials, he's testified before Congress, he's on YouTube. If you don't have enough today, you can look him up. And the book, Dreamland, has won a number of awards, an Amazon Best Books Award, a National Book Critics Circle Award. It was nominated for the Penn and John Kenneth Galbraith Award. And it's really a great book, and the author is a very gracious person who traveled all the way from California to New Haven, which is, we all love New Haven, but to talk to us today. So please help me welcoming Mr. Sam Quinones.
Thanks a lot, appreciate it. All right then, thank you. Thank you very much for all your work and bringing me here. My brother went to school here. I went to Berkeley. But I this is like the fourth or fifth time I've been to New Haven, so it's great. How you guys doing? Everybody good? No PowerPoint today. Sorry. All right, no PowerPoint. Tried those, didn't work. So anyway, really great to be speaking to the medical school here. I just can't believe, it's weird. As I've done this has become my life almost, which is surprising to both me and my wife. When I was writing this book, there are chairs up here if you guys want to come up and sit here, right there. Feel free. When I was writing the book, I had these conversations with my wife and a lot of conversations with myself that went kind of like, when this book comes out, it's going to be 3 to 6 months, and then it's just going to fade right out of sight. The reason I thought that was because everywhere I went, I found nobody wanting to really talk about it. Everyone wanted to hide it. On the contrary, it's a lot like the early days of the AIDS epidemic, where people would do anything. The obituaries were all fabrications. Nobody really wanted to confront the idea, and certainly above all, families of loved ones who had grown addicted to these drugs definitely did not want to. And if you didn't have that, well, the media didn't really pay attention. Nonprofits often didn't care. Sometimes some government agencies definitely did, but some did not. And politicians found it easier to point their interest somewhere else. Book comes out in 2015, and we prepared for all this, and then ever since then, it's been like kind of a rising, kind of floating upward. The book doesn't even seem like, it seems like a like a little bit like when your kid goes off to college, you know, you're kind of like taking on a life of its own, and that's how we feel about Dreamland. It's like, go Dreamland, you know. So now, but the amazing thing for us is that getting these invitations to speak at these different places, and I really believe it's important to speak at medical schools. Very important to do that. Speaking tomorrow in Long Island to a big health system, that's very important as well. But the key thing is that for a long time I just thought nobody would, because I was out in the country writing about it, people dying all over, and nobody seemed to care. And I just, that's kind of, so I'm surprised, stunned when I get invitations like this. It's great to be here. Today I want to talk a little bit about my conception of how this all got started, what went into it, and how we got to where we are. One place that starts is really in the 1980s, that far back, I believe. I grew up I'm 59, I grew up in the 1970s. I grew up watching all these great movies about heroin, you know, Serpico and French Connection 1 and 2. These are great movies. If you've ever seen them, check them out. If you haven't seen them, check them out. But they are dated. They are about the heroin world before, years ago, right? When New York was the hub. And New York was the hub because a very, very large chunk of our heroin came from the Far East, came from Turkey, came from Burma, Thailand. It crossed 2 continents and then an ocean, and it therefore got to our shores and eventually got to the addict's arm very, very weak and very expensive. In fact, our first epidemic really, or epidemic in the 1970s, I should say, really was not characterized by a lot of death like today. It was because of that, because a lot of the heroin was pretty weak by the time addicts were using it. And then in the 1980s, all that changed. You'll remember that, or maybe some of you won't, but some of you will, that these were the years when the great Colombian cartels were very powerful, fearsome, very effective, kind of an underworld FedEx in a sense. And they were effectively trafficking their cocaine here. They also began to traffic heroin. Mexicans were not quite there yet, but they were getting there. And these two groups essentially changed our heroin market forever. They began to bring in heroin, and that heroin got here every year cheaper and every year more potent. Okay, so basically it was a business situation where that heroin in the addict world, that's a better kind of heroin. If you got heroin that's potent and cheaper, then that's much better. And it outcompeted the heroin coming from the Far East. And so by the end of the 80s, early 1990s, all of our heroin, well, the lion's share, let's say, of our heroin was coming from Latin America, from Colombia. Increasingly today, of course, it's now virtually all from Mexico. Except nobody noticed. Nobody cared. Because, why? Because we had crack, we had meth later, we had pot always. We had other priorities. And heroin was not one of them. Heroin was kind of like this old thing that a few addicts in every town did, but really they weren't causing any problems. And it was certainly not the issue that crack had become. 1980s as well. Again, some of you remember, some of you will not. We also experienced what I term a revolution in pain management in America. This began with young pain specialists, kind of early into the profession, into their careers, seeing that in fact we did a very poor job of treating pain. And they began to push against some of the older limitations that they felt were existent then. And they began to make the argument, we could do a much, much better way treatment of pain. But we're afraid to use the one tool that would allow that to happen. And we're afraid unnecessarily. This tool is narcotic painkiller, opioid painkillers. And we should be using them far more aggressively. They are cheap, they're very effective, and they began to make the argument, very controversial, that they're now known, science now knows these pills to be virtually non-addictive when used to treat pain. There was no evidence that science knew this to be true, but these are young Turks. They're revolutionaries. They're kind of guys who want to just break down the doors, and for a lot of revolutionaries, ends justify the means. And to these guys, that's what they felt. It didn't matter. They just kicked down some doors, began to change how older docs viewed these drugs and push on, and they didn't really give too much thought to the evidence that there really was no evidence, actually, that this was the case. They were joined in this by the pharmaceutical companies, whom they viewed as allies, because the pharmaceutical companies were making the new tools through which they could treat pain. They viewed themselves naturally as allies. That pharmaceutical companies, with their money, lobbying power, whatnot, added a megaphone that these young pain specialists really didn't have. So together, they began to change the culture in medical schools and in medicine and pain management in America. Little by little, they say we're an epidemic of pain in this country. We do a poor job. We've got the tools. We shouldn't be afraid of using these tools anymore because science now knows they're not addictive. They were joined, in fact, as the years passed, particularly into the 1990s, by key institutions in medicine that began to agree and began to go along with this idea. The VA was a big one, early adopter of opioid therapies for pain. JCO, the Hospital Accreditation Organization, big one, begin to make the claim that doctors need to treat this, view these drugs as helpful tools, and one way of doing that is to view pain now as the fifth vital sign. This was a crucial moment. I'm a layman, I'm a crime reporter, immigration reporter. I don't really know anything about healthcare when I started this whole thing. It seemed to me bizarre that would be a pivotal moment in all this, but in fact, talking with doctors, particularly older docs at the time, that was. When they heard pain is now to be considered the fifth vital sign, that helped a lot of them get over that hump of fear of using these drugs, believing them to be addictive. The problem is pain is not a vital sign, right? It's not something you can measure objectively. It's also seemed to me bizarre because the doctors were then being pressured to batter pain down to zero. But what vital sign do you want to get down to zero? You know, I mean, the pulse, or you'd be dead, right? Apparently pain is the only vital sign that you actually want to not exist anymore, right? But there were other things that were going on as well. This was the years of the patients' rights movement, which was, a good idea. Patients have rights, doctors should listen to patients, et cetera. But it kind of, in this context, got pushed a little too far. It seems to me there became the idea, grew up the idea in the patients' rights movement that pain, particularly when it came to pain is what the patient says it is, where the patient says it is, when the patient, kind of extracting all clinical experience of the doctor from the patient-doctor relationship. The patient's just going to tell the doc, here's what's going on. You treat me. At the same time, I think we began as a culture to treat doctors as car mechanics, in a sense. We began to view the doctors as, I'm going to take my body into you, you're going to fix it, and I'm not really going to be much about, the accountability factors. So when you tell me, gee, part of your pain is due to the fact that I'm overeating, that I smoke, I drink, I eat poorly, I don't get enough exercise, all that, Americans increasingly as a culture began to say, you know what, that's hard work. I mean, you do it, doc. You take care of me. You fix me. You're the car mechanic. Don't tell me what I need to do. I think in time grew up these ideas that doctors needed to be accountable. Patients demanded accountability from doctors, not wanting any of their own, but they definitely demanded it from doctors. And one of these ways of getting there was what's known as Press-Ganey scores, or doctor evaluations, in which a patient gets to say, did the doctor treat you well? Boom, yes or no. Very kind of dull-edged instruments, really, these evaluations. But in the context of an increasing push to liberally prescribe narcotic painkillers, they became levers through which doctors were extorted. They had to force to prescribe more, because if you don't give me the pills that I say I need, because now I'm telling you the pain is where it is, when it is, all that, I'm going to give you a bad evaluation. Too many of those, and the doctor gets dinged loses hospital privileges, can be fired, et cetera, et cetera. So it becomes kind of a way of extorting, pressuring docs increasingly to prescribe these pills. Managed care, these are, by the way, these are also the years when you see the advent of those 0 to 10 pain scales. I'm sure you've all seen those or used them, for goodness sake. Forget where I am. But also the smiley face, frowny face, scales, all that kind of stuff. Is your pain this? Is your pain that? You know, that kind of thing. All this grows up. Managed care was a big part of this. Managed care comes along in these years, and we as Americans lose the most precious commodity that we have with a doctor, and that is time. A doctor told me one time, you know, when you're in medical school, we learned that you can really learn almost anything you need to know about a patient just by sitting and talking, just listening, and then do a few tests, confirm what you think you know, and you're on your way. But we lose that with managed care. We lose our most, as we want to make doctors more accountable, Press Ganey scores, all that, we lose really the most important commodity with doctors, and that is time spent. Increasingly, primary care docs, it's like 12, 13 minutes per patient. They become churn factories, just push them in and out, get them going. Don't have much time for learning much about the patient, much about the patient's background, history, any of that. This, I believe, was accompanied, though, by changes in American culture that I think were essential to this. I think increasingly as Americans, we began to fear pain, began to believe that we were entitled to a life free of pain. We won the Cold War, began to believe that, you know, just let's kick back. 50 years of fighting those damn communists, man. I just want to kick back. I don't want to be bothered with the complications of life in a complicated world. The world was about to get a whole lot more complicated. We just wanted to kind of kick back. Convenience, comfort. This idea that, again, that doctors must fix us. That we weren't really going to be part of the solution, that accountability for our own wellness kind of went out the way. During these years, of course, community medicine and focus on wellness became kind of passé, and medicine became more episodic. So if you have a hurt shoulder, you take that shoulder in, get it looked at by some urgent care guy. He doesn't know who you are. You don't know who he is. The early physical stopped. The doctor that you had from the day you were born to the day you die, that just ended. We lose all these essential components to community health and wellness, and it's replaced by this more churning kind of managed care idea, through which pills are a perfect complement. Because if you got to get the patient out of your office quick, out of your clinic fast, well, there's no better way than to pull out a prescription pad. And everybody knows when the prescription pad comes out, appointment's over and you're on your way, everyone's happy. I'm happy that he's getting the hell out of my office. He's happy because he got the pills that he apparently has to have. This was kind of all part of what went into this, creating a new attitude towards opioids and narcotic painkillers in America. 1996 was a crucial year. You can look at prescribing. There's seats down here, by the way, guys, if you're interested, feel free. Prescribing patterns for years, just narcotic prescribing was like this. And then in 96, it takes off like an airplane. Doesn't stop rise until a few years ago. This was also a time when 96 was when they passed the Clinton era welfare reform that limited welfare participation to 5 years. But you could get, it didn't limit the number of years you could spend on disability. So people whose real issue was economic migrated to disability, SSI, SSDI, and that comes with a Medicaid insurance card through which you can get all the pills you want if you can get a doctor to tell somebody that you need them. This was another part of this whole thing. 1996 though was perhaps most important because that was the year your own Connecticut-based Purdue Pharma came out with the drug we all know as Oxycontin. This was a crucial moment these years for this to happen because this was when pharmaceutical sales were also changing. It used to be pharmaceutical sales were done by a bunch of guys, almost all of them guys, older guys, gray business suits. lived in the community, were part of the community. They were ex-pharmacists, ex-docs. They knew their stuff. They knew the pills that they were. They were not brought in because they were good salespeople. They were brought in because they knew what they were talking about, and they had a long history of studying it. They became essential factors for doctors who were being overwhelmed by the amount of information coming out of medicine. They became essential, so doctors would rely on them, would resort to, tell me about this pill, how does that work? Because they believed them, they had credibility. They were in the churches, they were in the Little Leagues, they were in Kiwanis Club, Chamber of Commerce, in the communities with these doctors. They knew them well, and when their own company screwed up, sometimes the drug reps would come hat in hand, I'm so sorry, we really messed up. There were 35,000 sales reps in America, drug sales reps in America in early 1990s. That industry itself went through a massive revolution. A sales force arms race ensued through the 1990s, hiring more and more. And so we went from 35,000 sales reps in 1990 to over 100,000 in the year 2000. And no longer were there people who knew. Those older guys were shown the door. The newer folks were all young, a lot of women, a lot of very good-looking young people, didn't know a thing about pills, except for what the sales manager told them to say. They did know how to sell. They were from car rental places, computer gadgets, just right out of college, very fresh. They were never part of the community. They were moving on in 6 months to a year. They were not part of the churches or the Kiwanis or the Chamber of Commerce. They were just flying in. They didn't know anything about what they were selling, but they did know how to sell, and they sold it through giveaways. They gave stuff away, and the literature shows that you don't have to give a whole lot of stuff away before people start thinking you're just a wonderful, wonderful person. Particularly, they brought lunch. Lunch was great. Why was lunch great? Because they learned if you butter up the staff of a doctor's office, that doctor is putty in your hands, man. He'll buy anything. Lisa's here with lunch. Oh my God, I love her. That's the third time in the last 3 months, man. Let's just buy whatever the hell Lisa's selling, man. You know, they gave away hats and all this stuff. They gave away. Again, this was a time when it was all about sales. Purdue Pharma was part of that. It was not the biggest part, though. Pfizer had 12,000 sales reps by the end of that decade. Purdue had about 1,000 hawking Oxycontin. But Purdue was notable because it was the only company that was selling a narcotic in this way, and only company selling a narcotic in this way as if it were non-addictive. They gave away hats, and they gave away trips to Scottsdale for continuing medical education. They gave away, there was a wonderful CD that they used to give away. They had, the hat said, a fishing hat, the one to start with and stay with, you know, that was their motto. Kind of. They gave away a wonderful CD that I saw on eBay. It was called Swing in the Right Direction with Oxycontin. And there was this couple, elderly couple, because they're trying to convince a lot of the elderly docs to go around along with this new plan, you know. The elderly couple holding hands, walking through the garden, you know, just like swinging to Oxycontin and stuff. And the back, a bunch of, you know, Count Basie and Woody Herman and Andrew, swing band tunes, because that's who they're trying to give us. This was the way drugs began to be sold in the 1990s. There was go, sell, hard sell. These folks could not have told you a lot that they learned on their own about these drugs. They were told by the sales manager what to say, and they learned to sell it, and they were like locusts. One doc told me, I used to have maybe 10 to 12 visits by drug reps a week. Then it became a dozen a day. I just stopped keeping track. It was like this hordes of these people. I didn't know who they were, and they were never around long enough for me to even know their names. They were just there moving up the territory, so to speak. Excuse me. So in the end, all of this, basically marketing, worked. And we began to see huge changes in the way doctors prescribe narcotic painkillers, believing that they were non-addictive. This creates a massive new supply, coast to coast, of drugs, of narcotics, in medicine cabinets. It also creates a black market, because as you are as you are overprescribing all these pills, some of them leak out into the black market. Pain management also changes radically. Used to be in the 70s, pain management was you take one patient and you design a whole array of strategies around that person. Acupuncture, diet, job therapy, it's pain treatment, right? So marital counseling, marriage is pain. So you get marital counseling if you're in pain. Seriously, they used to do that because insurance companies reimbursed for all of that. They reimbursed for this wide array, treating every individual as an individual, right? As the 90s proceeded and this pain revolution proceeded, increasingly insurance companies stopped. They just stopped reimbursing for all these different treatments. They were long-term treatments. They required us as Americans to buy in, to say, yeah, I'll participate, I will work out more, I will watch what I eat, et cetera, all that kind of thing. Insurance companies began to say, yeah, no, we're not going to do that. And as doctors were facing, feel sorry for docs in those years, because doctors were facing what they were told was a national epidemic of pain. They were being told pain's fifth vital sign, being pressured, now you got to prescribe more of this, now you're getting threatened with lawsuits if you don't, now you got patients telling you, fix me, doc. And increasingly, as time went on, to face this epidemic, they had but one tool, and that was opioid painkillers. In 1990, these statistics are kind of graphic, I think. 1990, according to the UN, world supply of hydrocodone, the entire world supply of hydrocodone was 3 tons. 2010, 20 years later, the entire world supply of hydrocodone was 42 tons, and 99% of that was used right here in the United States. That's just a revolution. That's just a complete change in how that happened. But you know, we thought we were doing that in a vacuum. But you know, nothing happens in a vacuum, and much less in a globalized world. Before, Oxycontin was a game changer for the way it was promoted. But it was a game changer for another reason as well. Before Oxycontin, people would mess around and abuse a low dose of, say, Vicodin or Percocet, these kinds of drugs. They would develop a kind of a moderate addiction, but they never developed the raging addiction that would make them desperate enough to overcome all their qualms and move to heroin, because all those pills contain, you know, acetaminophen. And so by the time you're doing that, you've done some significant damage to your internal organs, and it just didn't happen that often. It just was not that common. Occasionally, yeah, but really not in large numbers. There was no bridge to to heroin, I'm sorry, before Oxycontin. Oxycontin comes out, and as you know, had no abuse deterrent, had no acetaminophen, nothing in it for 14 years of its life. It was 40 milligrams of oxycodone, 80 milligrams, 160 milligrams. It takes people's addiction up to much, much higher levels, far more desperate levels. The doctor sometimes gets leery, cuts them off. Insurance ends, whatever, a lot of reasons, people begin to resort to that enormous black market on the street that we've created because of all the supply. They find that on the street, the pills are going for $1 a milligram. So that's $150, $200, $300 a day. You cannot afford that, and it's at that moment when people all across the country begin to notice that change in our heroin market that took place in the 1980s that nobody paid attention to. Because all of a sudden, looking about on the street for a new alternative that is as potent and much, much cheaper, that happens, that heroin coming up from Latin America, increasingly Mexico, perfectly fits that bill. I don't believe we'd have the kind of heroin problem that we have today if all our heroin, so much of our heroin, we're still coming from the Far East and getting here very, very weak and very, very expensive. It's just not the same alternative, easy alternative switch, no-brainer, as a lot of addicts have described it. We would not have a heroin problem in America today either were it not for Oxycontin creating the terrain, in a sense. We would also not have the kind of heroin problem we have today without very cheap, very potent, by that I mean the kind of fatality we're seeing now, without the very cheap, very potent heroin coming up from Latin America, increasingly from Mexico. Ground zero in all this starts in Columbus to Ohio to the north, Cincinnati, eastern Kentucky, eastern Tennessee, parts of Virginia, all of West Virginia, western Pennsylvania, parts of southern Indiana too, is where this all gets going. Why? Because I believe pharmaceutical reps had data showing the doctors in those areas were already prescribing a lot of pills, not narcotics necessarily, but very liberally prescribing pills. Why were they doing that? Because so many people in that area were in pain. It was economic pain. The only people they really had to turn to were docs, right? So if you want workers' comp, if you want SSI, if you want SSD, you got to go to the doctor. And doctors being, I think, in a lot of those areas, besieged by patients whose real issue was not physical so much as economic. They didn't know what to do, and pills were about the only thing they could do for them. Pharmaceutical companies had that information, which doctors prescribed a lot, and in that region, that's where they focused. All those sales reps went down, and they made, in Purdue's case, made biggest bonuses in the history of the pharmaceutical industry. A good year for a pharma rep would be $20,000, $30,000 bonus. Pharmaceutical reps from Purdue were making $100,000 a quarter, $400,000 a year. It was unlike anything had ever been paid in the pharmaceutical industry. But you know, I came upon this story started working on it really in 2009, 10. And by then, this story had morphed far beyond that area where it had really begun in the mid-1990s, that ground zero map that I kind of very roughly drew for you. It had far beyond, it had spread, in fact, what I noticed, it had spread to some of the wealthiest, better off suburbs of America. It spread to Charlotte, suburbs of Salt Lake, of Indianapolis, Minneapolis, suburbs of Columbus, places where people had done the best. I began to notice that it was in those places where people had done the best in our run-ups of economic expansions of the last 20, 30 years, where over and over you found that's where the lion's share of people were, and they were families whose loved ones were getting addicted to drugs used, of all things, to numb pain. Like, you look at their lives, you go, what pain, man? You know, your lives are perfect. You know, aren't they? You have everything. Don't you have a perfect life? And as time went on, I began to realize that I had to broaden the story that I thought I was writing. I was a crime reporter. I thought I was writing a story about drug traffic, the Great American Drug Trafficker book, right? The Great American, pharmaceutical reps and heroin traffickers, great stuff. I love that stuff. But as time went on, I was forced to kind of broaden and see that this story had become far bigger. It was about who we were as Americans, what we had become as a country. I was only a crime reporter, as I say, but I couldn't really avoid certain conclusions. And one of them was that at the root of this problem really was that we had spent 35 years as a country destroying community. We began to exalt the private sector, win the Cold War, begin to believe that the free market is some kind of this infallible God, the benefits of which we'd be foolish to doubt. We began to admire wealthy business people, regardless of the way they made their money, did anything of value for our neighborhoods, or on the contrary, we rewarded people who devised methods for shipping jobs and destroying communities overseas. Did the same with our sports heroes, entertainment celebrities. It was all about the person who had made the most money, the individual, the exalting of the one individual. We, meanwhile, I think, laughed at government as inefficient, as bloated, as dull, as wasteful, on and on and on. You know, years ago, we had, as some of you will remember, a president who said government is the problem. Now, that's a nuanced idea he was presenting, I know, but it became interpreted as government is to be thwarted. It denied really the American experiment, which is to say that all government comes from us. Now we were invited to say government needs to be battered away, kept at bay, starved, beaten back, because it only is a threat to our personal freedom. We have think tanks that said that. You know, I was, however, in the middle then of a story about a drug nightmare created almost entirely by the private sector, unleashing what I think is one of the great threats to personal freedom in America today, which is opiate addiction. As I was doing the story, moreover, the only people that I could really interview were cops, prosecutors, coroners, jailers, public health workers, county drug counselors, all of whom were drawing a government salary. I began to realize that this story turned on its head everything the kind of the governing ethos of the country had proposed in the last 35 years. In this story, in fact, all profits were private. Going to the pharmaceutical companies, the Purdue company owned by the Sackler family in Stamford, Connecticut, is now, as you probably have read in certain places, valued at $14 billion net worth by Forbes, wealthier than the Rockefellers, due entirely to $35 billion worth of sales of Oxycontin since the drug came out in 1996. All costs, meanwhile, were borne by the public, by jails, by public health departments, cops, prosecutors, coroners' offices, on and on and on. But you know, this story I began to understand as I dug into it and got enthralled with the deeper themes of what I was writing about. Goes beyond that as well. It's not just that. It gets deeper. It seemed to me that as Americans, we all were living in a time of fantasy. We wanted to believe in silver bullets and easy answers to complicated adult problems, that we didn't have to be accountable. Seems to me some of the great founding ideas of America got twisted during these years in our own pursuit of comfort, of convenience above all else. Self-reliance, a great American idea, became isolation. Everybody just alone, just doing their own thing in their house. Accountability, I think, was transformed into tantrums when public officials or doctors or cops didn't do exactly what we thought they should do. We told pollsters we'd lost faith in our American system. You can see this in politics as well. Compromise. Compromise today is a dirty word. You know, the idea is you bend to the idea of ideas of others. Now a noble politician is one who never ever changes his mind. At the same time, I think we adopted unrealistic expectations of how much pain we should be asked to endure as Americans. We began to believe we were entitled to a life free of pain. But it wasn't just now physical pain, it was also a psychological pain, emotional pain that we should not be asked to endure. We believed old rules, you know, this were years when I think it's interesting, when old rules don't apply to us somehow. Well, that's what we felt. It was a fantasy time. Remember, these were two, three things to keep in mind. These were years, remember, when we believed it was just the most normal thing for us baseball players to hit more than 60 home runs every year. It happened twice, the whole history of the sport. Now it's happening every year, and we're just like, well, they're just better players now, I guess, you know? We believe that, hey, if you package thousands and thousands of really non-performing home loans into one security, and Standard & Poor's stamps that thing AAA, that's a magnificent place to put your money. And we believe that massive, widespread, almost indiscriminate prescribing of narcotic pain pills derived from the opium poppy would somehow not result in massive, widespread addiction. It was a time of fantasy. We wanted to have it all, seems to me, during these years as a culture. Pills embodied that. I mean, you get all of your pain reduced and you have no risk because they're non-addictive now. You know, it's like a magnificent time to be American. Avoidance of pain, which was a main engine in this, if you ask me. Americans' deep desire to avoid pain at all costs morphed into this kind of hypersensitivity. You know, we wander through social media now just looking to be offended, like an entire nation of Scarlett O'Hara's going, oh my God, I'm so offended that X, Y, or Z is happening. Everyone rushes to your defense and says, oh yeah, that person's terrible for offending you. Seems to me we got off into these kinds of things. We became ferocious at the same time in protecting our kids from feeling pain. really from feeling disappointment. That was really what we were most interested in. We gave out trophies on every sports team to every kid who showed up. God forbid anybody feel the pain of not being the most valuable player. As part of this, as we developed this exaltation of the private, of the individual, of the private sector and all this, we developed a deep fear. Phobia, I think, almost obsessive of the outside, of the public sphere in our communities. Fearing that never let our kids go outside, fearing that they'd skin their knees, fearing that they would lose in competition with their kids. You know that it's a sad thing to say, but in this country, there are parents who have been prosecuted for letting their kids go to the park alone. The worst two words, I think, in the English language are play date. It's a damn business meeting for 7-year-olds. You know, poor kids. Just go over and knock on the door. You know, when I was growing up in Southern California, my brothers and I were 4 of us. My mom was from Iowa, and she had a farm bell. And every afternoon at 6 in the afternoon, she would go to the sidewalk and ring that farm bell because it was time for dinner. And all her boys got used to just kind of dutifully running home for dinner when mom would be out there. I can still picture at the upper end of the street going like this. All the other kids on the street, I think they began to go just, oh, well, damn, must be time for dinner. Everyone starts running home when my mom starts ringing that bell, you know? Why did she ring that bell? Because she didn't have a clue where we were, right? But one place she knew we would never be is inside the house on a sunny Southern California afternoon. Now I go back to that same street, it's about 50 miles from where I now live, literally yet to see one single solitary human being on that street where I grew up. You know, the Atlantic Monthly ran a story a while back that said that kids who grew up in an era of hyper-protection, bubble-wrapped protection against physical pain were now demanding to be protected from painful ideas as well. They were going to college and demanding trigger warnings. Now, I had been to Berkeley. I had never heard the term trigger warning until I read that story. Trigger warnings, maybe some of you know better than I, are warnings that professors must give students to warn them against disturbing ideas they may encounter in the readings that they're about to do. Well, that's why you go to college, though, is to be disturbed. It's a great thing to be disturbed. It's not a bad thing. I went to Berkeley. We got real disturbed at Berkeley. It was fine. We're okay, you know. But anyway, as a culture, though, I began dig into this. I began to realize these are very, very big issues we're talking about here. It's not just drug trafficking, drug marketing. As a culture, you know, it seemed to me that we acted as if private consumption, the accumulation of stuff, was the path to happiness. We built into our suburbs a deep and sad, penetrating isolation, and we called that prosperity. We embrace technology, which connect us wonderfully in so many marvelous ways, but leave us frequently disconnected from the person who lives across the street or around the corner. I can say as a reporter that as Americans, we have grown deluded into believing that we are somehow informed by 24-hour cable news. 24-hour cable news is just like heroin. Okay? The same thing that heroin does, when people get addicted, they all kind of glom together and they're talking about dope. They don't talk to anybody else they used to know. They just talk about people who know dope, where to buy dope, how to use dope, blah, 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 blah. That's what 24-hour news has done to our body politic, bundles us all into little easily marketable bubbles, and we talk to each other who we believe like us, talk like us, think like us. The only time we're talking to anybody else is when we're sniping at them on social media. You know, it used to be we used to have to work for our opinions in America, work hard to develop an opinion. You had to develop them over time, reading, talking, listening to people who knew more than we did. Now they're prepackaged on these media for our easy consumption, kind of chicken McNuggets of opinion that we can just easily grasp and adopt. You want to know who to hate, who to look down on, who to snipe at? You know, we hate discomfort of any kind, and these new prepackaged opinions on 24-hour cable news or social media or wherever, talk radio, are our way of behaving as civic Americans without really doing the hard work of developing opinions, very much like folks who wanted to be pain-free without working out, without examining what they eat, how they exercise, very much like folks who want happiness and turn to heroin, quick and easy with no hard work. Seems to me that the result of all this is that we as Americans grew very isolated, separate from each other. We wound up distinct. We wound up fragmented, whether in poverty or in affluence. This is not an economic story. This cuts across all economics, it seems to me. You know, kids no longer play in the parks. In the street. Parks are underused. We feel pain from opposing ideas. Why then do we wonder that heroin is everywhere? Seems to me that our very search for painlessness, for comfort and convenience was a big part of what led us to this spot where we are right now. Heroin, it seems, is the final expression of values we have fostered in this country for 35 years and more. A final expression of our fetish for the private at the expense of the public, for isolation at the expense of community. It's a final stuff for a culture that believes that buying stuff will lead to happiness, a final expression of that. Heroin turns every addict, into a narcissistic, self-absorbed, solitary hyper-consumer. A life that finds opiates turns away from friends, from family, from really community, and devotes itself entirely to self-gratification by buying and using one product, and that product is the drug that makes being alone not just all right, but preferable. You know, I started my reporting career during the crack years, covering crack, and the hallmark institution of the crack epidemic was the crack house. Usually it was in a public place, in an old rental or an apartment building, or that was abandoned or something like that. Very public. You could very easily see it. This epidemic's hallmark is the private bedroom. The private bedroom that every mother wishes her children would stay in so they avoid the problems being outside. The private bedroom that is such a symbol of our American prosperity and the toxic nature sometimes of that prosperity. It's in that same private bedroom where so many addicts now are hiding their dope, shooting up, and dying. Isolation, I believe. Isolation is heroin's natural habitat. Heroin's a perfect symptom, I think, for how isolated we have become as Americans from each other and how much we have ignored or simply just killed off that would bring us together. I believe more strongly than ever, therefore, that the antidote to heroin is not naloxone. It is community. You want to keep kids off heroin? Really, seems to me, make sure people in your neighborhood do things together, in public, often. Fun public things, coffee shops, parks. Make your kids ride their bikes outside, let them skin their knees. Don't protect them from the consequences. Seems to me we got away from all that, from what is really best about our country. We rid ourselves, I think, of things that are so essential to us as human beings that they really literally have no price, and we have therefore allowed ourselves to be invaded by cheap crap. Heroin is what you get. Heroin's what you get when you do that. Today, probably know very well, supply of opiates on our street is so vast, so scarily potent, that getting into treatment takes months. Getting out is like Russian roulette. It's one of the most dangerous things you can do in America today is get out of treatment for opiates. Relapse, and with the potency of the drugs on the street, people are dying all across this country very, very commonly. You know, it seems to me that we awakened enormous ingenuity of that underworld FedEx, which is now mostly in Mexico. And they have discovered in turn fentanyl, that fentanyl is the new no-brainer product, the most profitable opiate ever known, and are now flooding our streets with it, and that's part of the problem that we face today. Football, amazing to say, all-American sport of football is now a gateway to heroin addiction all across this country. But you know, that's what happens when you start as a culture believing in easy answers and silver bullet solutions to complicated, nuanced problems. I think finally that the good news is that there is no solution. We tried the solitary solution, right? The sexy solution, the thing that'll solve all our problems. One pill for every individual's pain, a jail cell for every addict. I think, look where it got us. I think this epidemic is calling on us to do many things. Struck by that as I was working on this. It's really calling on us to examine many things that we've been doing in this country. But one of them is that I think we need to stop believing that there's an easy way out of every problem. That old rules don't apply to us just because we're Americans. That we have no need for each other as Americans. No, there is no solution to this problem. There are many solutions. Small, a mosaic of solutions, a symphony of solutions. All must be tried together. A lot of them must be improved. A lot of some may be discarded. But the good thing is that not one of them, this is a really good thing, not one of them is sexy. Not one will do the trick alone. Very healthy thing it's telling us, this epidemic. Of course, as doctors, I know who I'm talking to, I believe it's essential that doctors reassess all across this country how and to whom and what quantity they prescribe narcotic painkillers. Not that they should ever be banned, that's crazy. They have a role. But it's beyond me to understand why that role is to be in every medicine cabinet in America. I'm a layman, but I still do not understand why doctors got into the idea of prescribing 30 days worth of pain pills for post-surgery pain that's going to last 2 or 3 days. A big part of how we got into this. Excuse me. I think you as doctors and indeed as a medical school have a crucial role, and you will as you go out into your professions. Those of you who are students all across the country. Doctors and health systems can be leaders in getting out of this. Just as they led into this, they can be leaders in getting out of this. And I've seen health systems do this, work in a concerted way to understand through the data that only they have, through the budget that only they have, through the hundreds of employees that only they have, change a culture, begin to bring down prescribing so that it becomes part of the culture again. So at cocktail parties or on golf courses, people are talking about, gee, we're trying a new way of treating pain, or a more multidisciplinary approach to treating pain. I think this is what's happening. This is the good news, that this is happening little by little. I think the problem is no longer private, no longer hidden, as I discovered when I was starting this book in 2013-14, not so long ago. Parents, for the most part, a lot of them are stepping out of the shadows. That is so healthy. And as health professionals, I hope you will encourage that. They need, for the country's sake, to step out and tell their story so people understand how common addiction is, but they also need it for themselves. They need it, it's a balm to the pain that they will suffer for the rest of their lives, having lost a loved one. There's no longer just that thin line of government employees fighting this alone, quietly, thanklessly, sometimes under threat of lawsuit. And people are stepping out. Politicians are getting behind this. When I was doing my book, nobody was thinking about massive lawsuits against pharmaceutical companies. Now you see them popping up everywhere in every state in the country. The VA, an early adopter of opioid therapy, has done an entire U-turn, and I was just in Las Vegas, the VA pain clinic there, where they now have a whole wing for acupuncture. They have prescription for swimming, diet, and the doctor there told me something fascinating, I thought, and that was that very often what they really are trying to do is recreate community in the lives of the patients who are on chronic pain at 500, 600, 800 milligrams of opiates a day. Before he said the only time a lot of these guys would leave their houses when they come to us for the pills for the month. Now we're trying to find ways of creating community. One place they're finding it, this being Vegas, this being Vets, is motorcycle clubs. Turns out motorcycle clubs are a magnificent way of treating chronic pain. Anyway, finally I would say that as health professionals, you work in hospitals, you work in clinics, when you go out to the communities where you eventually end up, I think you have enormous convening power, and I want you to be aware that one of the great, encouraging, invigorating phenomena coming out of this epidemic is that all across the country, county after county after county, I've seen this in my travels everywhere, they are forming task forces, working groups, collaboration, whatever it is, trying to bringing together people who before never would have known each other, never have worked on a drug problem together, and together they're trying to figure this out. It's a fascinating response to a drug that thrives on isolation, creates more isolation. The response that Americans are having is to come together, to break down those silos, to build bridges to each other, to learn each other's first names and cell phone numbers. It sounds fundamental, sounds easy, sounds like obvious, right? Except we were not doing that. I'm hoping you as health professionals, when you get out there, or even from here in New Haven, will look for those opportunities to participate. Doctors need to be heard in those task forces. Too often they're not. Sometimes they're actually barred from being there because there's this idea that all doctors have been bought off. We need to break down. They need to hear your voice of experience. They need to hear what it's like to sit in an appointment with a person and tell that person part of your pain is that you overeat and you don't get enough exercise, and hear what that response is. So often people are oblivious to that there's another reason. There's many reasons for why this took place. In those task forces, in those community groups, whatever they're called, policy is going to be made. It's going to be made with you or without you. And if it's without you, you're not going to like what comes of it. Again, I think the public, you need to contribute your authentic voice. These are the things I think that we need to hear from you. We need to hear how difficult it is to deal with pain, with a person's pain, if you don't have insurance companies reimbursing for a wide array of strategies. But again, these are what we need to hear from you, and if you do that, if you are out in your community, if you are participating in these groups, if you're lending your voice to that, your patients will thank you. Your towns will thank you. Your counties, your country will thank you. And I like to say thank you all very, very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Very kind of you guys. I'm happy to hear scathing criticisms or fawning praise. Let's start with the fawning praise. Anybody? You in the back. Just tell me how great it was. No, kidding. Question? Yes, sir.
So I come at this with the lens of a state legislator. Actually, I saw just a note on the sidewalk that you were coming. I read your book about a month ago while I was still in session. So,
bless your heart.
One comment, two questions. The first comment is that I was listening to your book. A colleague came up to me and asked me what I was listening to. I said what it was, and he just looks at me cockeyed and basically sounds like that's a grim sort of thing to be listening to, sort of expression, but okay. But the two questions are this, is that A, what sort of criticisms have you gotten in terms of the intersection between race and the crack epidemic as compared to now the opioid crisis?
Yeah.
Why weren't we talking about how this is a mental health issue then, and now we're talking about it now? And then the other question is, what have you seen as successes on the state level in terms of what we can do to combat this, knowing that there is no cure-all?
Yeah. Take the last one first. You know, here's the thing that I also find wonderful. People ask me, where would you point to? And I would say, nowhere. Everybody's doing the same thing. What's fascinating is all these county groups I'm referring to, they're all starting up almost like mushrooms. Nobody did a pilot project and outlined 10 things you all need to do to combat and everybody form a group. Okay, now we're all going to do that. No. This all happened totally organically. And I see this everywhere I go. I'm not kidding, every county. All of a sudden, I was talking with folks in Brown County, Ohio. It's right on the Ohio River. They started this thing. Bringing together all these people, trying to figure out, and what's beautiful about it, I have to say, and maybe I'm romanticizing it a bit, but it is all messy. No one's like, they're half groping, half blind. They're like, I don't know, we're going to go this way. Shall we try this? Okay, let's try this. No one has the answer, and that's what's great about it. And so pointing to a place where everyone knows how to do this, no, there's nobody who knows how to do this. Everybody's figuring this out little by little. It's a mystery. It deals with the human brain. It's the universe and the brain. Two things I will never understand in my life, right? They're so vast, so deeply mysterious and sublime. So we're trying to fashion policies to deal with one of those. And, I think we need to revel in that. I think we need to say, yes, that's good. That we're just trying to figure it all out. Because along the way, what we're doing is creating the culture through which we can deal with that problem and the next drug problem and homelessness. And, but none of that happens without the Kiwanis Club. None of that happens without the PTA. None of that happens without the churches. It just doesn't happen. You have to have all of that, and the problem has been up to now, we've been so isolated, so siloed, even professions. Look, in medicine, perfect example. It stunned me when I first learned that, in American medicine, there is no association, no conference, no journal in which primary care docs, addiction specialists, and pain management specialists come together and go out for a beer and meet each other. This after 20, 25 years of primary care docs prescribing highly addictive medicine for pain, we still don't have any place where these people come together. But you multiply that in all kinds of ways all across the country for 2 decades or more, and you get to where we are. So I would say that every county, I would point to every county and say, yeah, good job. Just do it. Just try to figure this out. And yeah, use the extra money that's now coming out of Washington. Good. And of course, we need a lot more money for research, brain research in particular, I think. Very, very, very important. I think that's coming. From my understanding, I was speaking in NIDA a couple of months ago, and it sounds like that's definitely on the way. Good, all that. But I would hesitate to say, look, this is the county that knows how to do it. Nobody knows how to do it. One of the reasons is because it's like no one's in an island. They say, why does Chicago have a lot of gun violence? Well, I'm sure there's a lot of reasons, but one of them is it's not an island somewhere. It lives in a country with 400 million guns, right? So there's lots of supply. The supply is everywhere, and you can, so that's part of it, So every county has to deal with this on its own. That's why you're seeing all those lawsuits. The counties are buckling under the weight of all this, right? And they are looking around, and I think it's basically would be political malpractice at a county or state level not to be suing the pharmaceutical companies over this, because you are faced with cutting back coroner services, cutting back jail services, cutting back public health, foster children, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, because of all this weight that you have to carry that was not that you didn't cause. So, to me, I think let's look for them all, and I've told politicians, Go to the little county groups and shine a light and say, hey, good job, way to go. Because they're all just trying to figure it out, But it never comes without the Kiwanis Club. That's my opinion, that kind of stuff. Rotary, it's all important. Now, with regard to the second thing, question that you asked. Yes, this is almost entirely a white issue. I have never seen in my reading of the drug issues in America, drug problems, certainly in modern America since World War II, anything like this. This is unique for 3 reasons. One is it did not start with drug mafias. It started with doctors. Number 2, we've never had a deadlier epidemic. More people died of drug overdoses in 2016 than Americans who died in the entire Vietnam War. Okay? Most of those were opioid overdoses. And number three, that is almost entirely white. And we've never had such a uniracial, if that's a word, drug problem. A big part of why we are now, but it's a nuanced thing too. A big part of why we are not, we are now today proposing that drug addiction be treated as a disease with non-incarceration techniques or strategies is because it mostly affects white people, and they are the majority, and they vote, and they see their state representatives in the grocery line and this kind of thing, and all of a sudden those people who once voted pretty much in lockstep without thinking too much about it for the, quote, tough on crime idea, it was almost like dogma in certain areas, now all of a sudden it's compassion, right? That's the buzzword. And that is almost entirely because it says a new demographic that has been, that demographic and that one alone has been affected. It's a remarkable thing, and I do not understand the uniracial nature of this yet. I'm trying my best. I don't hear any answers that really satisfy me. I have to say I've been over it and over it and over, and I still yet to have a real good feeling on that. But there's something else that needs to be said about this whole comparison to the crack thing, because I covered crack, and I remember what it was like. Crack was a drug problem, but mostly it was a violence problem. It was intensely blighting of neighborhoods, destroying black neighborhoods, destroying Latino neighborhoods, sometimes working class white neighborhoods, but mostly it was affecting black and working class neighborhoods, basically. I covered this in a town called Stockton in California, where I was a crime reporter for 4 years. Almost everything I did was connected to the violence of drive-by shootings, carjackings, crack houses being taken over, all of that kind of thing. So a big part of our approach to the crack epidemic was the fact that violence, the rise of street gangs, Uzis, drive-bys, all that kind of thing, that was a big part of it. I do not remember, Stockton had a fairly large black community, a very large Latino community. I do not remember in the 4 years I was there, one person from that community saying we needed more addiction treatment. It was always, get these guys in prison, get these guys off this, we cannot live. The first week I was there, I toured a street where there was a family. There was like guys selling crack, 15, 20 guys. There was an elementary school right here. You can't live that. We can't have business. You can't have peace of mind. People were diving for their bathtubs when the drive-bys would happen, right? And so I believe that one big reason why we focused on incarceration during the crack epidemic, first was I don't think we knew quite as much about addiction as we did today. Second was the violence. Third was the racial nature of it. It's a complicated story. I do not believe, I have to tell you, I do not believe for a second that we would have the same focus on treatment and removing felony records and avoiding incarceration and all that if this epidemic today were accompanied by the kind of violence that were destroying neighborhoods all across the country back in the late 80s, early 1980s. It just would not happen. I don't believe. This is not, though. It's very quiet. As I said, nobody was paying attention. You couldn't avoid crack. It was in your face. The violence was overwhelming and very scary, and the places that it affected worse were those neighborhoods that I talked about. Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah.
So one of the things that you covered in your book really well, the failure of the scientific and the medical community overall, the watchdogs. I mean, it's easy to blame the pill mills, some young Turks, and the pharmaceutical companies. But
yeah.
So I was in graduate school in early 90s, and Kathleen Foley came and gave a talk.
Oh, wow.
And the theme of the talk was, if you have pain, chronic pain, you don't get addicted to it. I mean, she showed her series. So this was in a major medical center. Nobody got up and challenged it.
Right.
So, and then, like the fifth vital sign, that came out of American Pain Society.
Yes,
I don't think anybody, 50% of the people quit, so the incredible quietness and, so that's also very disturbing because there's going to be more produce, there's going to be more money to be made. I mean, if the watchdogs don't do their jobs, if we don't stand up, and these are the people who knew better, because we can also say a lot of things that are new, but there was nothing new about opioid addiction. People knew this is the third wave.
Yeah.
So the people who went through the 60s, 70s, they were also quiet. So, and one of the things that I always show when I give talks is that New England little letter to the editor, like one
Porter and
paragraph.
Jick.
Yes, got over 1,000 citations.
Poor guy. You think about Dr. Jick is still alive. He's in Boston, and you know when he dies, his obituary is going to say the guy who wrote this letter. The truth is, he's right. That letter was correct. If you remember what he was saying people who treated with these narcotics in hospital, and remember, he was taking data from the 60s and 70s because he wrote the letter in 79. So in those years, the scrutiny over how you use these drugs was complete. You had to have 3 signatures. Everyone's like hovering over, my God, is it going to, you know? And so in that situation, when people do not have access to massive supply, you will not get that kind of addiction. It's just, he's right. It's just the problem was, it was then, the worst part about that letter was the headline, which said, addiction rare in patients treated with narcotics. Didn't say in hospital. And that was just such a flaw that, you know, but what he was, what the truth is, and I came to this, I lived in Mexico a long time, and in Mexico you are invited to believe that our drug problem in America is demand driven, that our guys are just selling dope to the gringos because all those gringos have this insatiable demand for dope. No, I don't believe that. This told me, taught me that supply is what ignites, right? You know, be careful, illegal supply. People always ask me, well, do you think now we should legalize drugs? And that's a complicated thing. We talk about marijuana a bit, but my feeling is be careful what you make legal. And be careful what you make legal in a hurry, and be careful how potent what you make legal is, because that is going to be the stuff that's most widely abused, as alcohol and cigarettes are now. But with regard to that letter to the New England Journal of Medicine on page 126 of the January 12th, 1980 thing that nobody paid any attention to until the pain specialist got wind of it and started citing it. You know that letter's been cited in Google Scholar, I think, what was it, like 900 times? It was a letter to the editor. Yeah, whatever it is. Now New England Journal of Medicine puts, have you seen the disclaimer? They put over the letter online, this is not a study, this is not anything to be basing research on, blah, 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 like that kind of thing, which is, of course, the way Dr. Jick intended it. It was not intended to be some kind of research document. It was just like, by FYI, just check this out. It's it became known as, you know, it was like a game of telephone. Nobody read it. Everyone's like, oh, Porter and Jick. Go to cocktail parties, conferences. Well, certainly you're aware of Porter and Jick. Yeah, of course I'm aware of Porter. What, are you kidding me? I know all about that dang report, that dang study, that landmark study. You know, Time Magazine called it a landmark study in 2001. I'm like, what the hell is that? Man, so glad my name is not on that story for posterity, you know. But to me, that was one weird thing. I wandered around the house talking about my wife going, is it possible that all scientific research is done in this way? Taking a little letter out of context and totally misinterpreting it, and then coming up with some new idea that's totally preposterous, which in 25 years we'll all sit back and laugh. Do you believe that they all used to believe that there's no addictive risk from opiates, blah, blah, that kind of thing? You know? So, yeah, there was, yes.
So I love your talk. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.
The one thing I'd love to hear more about is what is the role, what has been and could be and is the role of media in creating the problem and in the solution to the problem?
Well, I would say that to some degree, the media back in the late 90s kind of parroted what folks were saying with, again, quoting without reading the Porter and Jick letter. You know, Time Magazine said, Porter and Jick is a landmark study that does much to, I can't remember the exact quote, but I put it in my book, does much to change what we know about addiction and la-di-da-di-da. You know, total nonsense, nothing like what the guy really intended. So initially it was that. And then as time went on, by the time I was onto it, my feeling was the biggest role of the media in covering this was that it wasn't covering it. It was, no, there was, I mean, part of it was that there weren't people who wanted to talk about it. It was very hard to find people who wanted to talk about it. But then I think a critical mass was reached. I think my book, frankly, had a little bit to do with it. And all of a sudden now what you're seeing is every major media outlet has an opioid reporter, and people are stumbling and tripping over each other. They just absolutely have to cover this now, which is good, very, very good. I think a little bit too often they're resorting to cliches. I've seen, I think, about as many stories as I ever want to see about heroin with a guy with a needle in his arm and the thing tied up. That's actually, it's interesting. As an aside, my entire book, I'm kind of proud of this, honestly. Entire book about heroin, there's nobody shooting up. Now, why? Well, first, because I think that story's been done a million times, and I'm not one to deal in cliches. I try to avoid cliche in my writing, but also because I thought it's always been a distraction from the real issue, which are some of these larger topics that I've dealt with. I was talking about at the end, like community and isolation and applauding people who make just lots of money and not the people who actually make the society work, and the demanding politicians not compromise, not change anything. Those kinds of things to me seem to be a bigger part of this story than something that's been done a million times in every newspaper, with the guy with the. So I would say that now, though, I mean, I'm welcome the coverage. I think it's good that more people are talking, because it has also helped families come out. That's one of the main roles. That's one of the biggest things we could do, it seems to me, is help families come out of the shadows, because then we all see addiction, how common it is. And so it's not this kind of obscure thing that it's affecting every family, Yes?
So I have some scathing criticism, but not too scathing.
Okay, fine. No fawning praise?
The thing that I do agree with you wholeheartedly on is the solution. I do think the solution is inherently in building communities.
The what, I'm sorry?
Solution is inherently in building communities and
Yes.
really having all these different disciplines of docs coming together. I think you're right in that. But I do think that considering for different minority groups, and specifically I'll talk about Black American, this notion of isolation just doesn't hold true in terms of opioid use disorders, right? So in thinking about the heroin epidemic, you talked about the crack epidemic, but the heroin epidemic, this is not the first time we've had an opioid epidemic, right?
Yeah.
It's the first time that it's reached the level of affecting white people, and we've had the most opiate-related deaths. You're absolutely correct.
Yes.
But then 60s and 70s, we had a heroin epidemic that totally destroyed Black communities, right?
Yes. And Latino community.
And Latino communities, but did not have the violence associated with it, but still it was not looked as a medical illness. So
Yeah.
I think that one of the things that we cannot minimize really is the racism, right, that is inherent in talking about the opiate epidemic. And I think that the issue about the media, we see this because in a newspaper and everything, so the new face of addiction or the new face when it's all, right, and we're minimizing the experiences of Black people that have dealt with heroin use in their communities for years. And it's interesting because a lot of my patients, Black patients who I work with, whole communities, people are doing dope together. So it's not something that nobody knows or, it's hidden or somebody won't know, or a lot of people know, but yet, there hasn't been any emphasis put on what happens there, what's different there. It's not hidden behind anything. People are doing it together. You go to the green, there are whole friends and sets of Black people doing, dope together. So
Heroin or other?
Heroin
Really?
Primarily, yeah.
Okay.
So
Because I would tell you that I have never seen that. I have not seen that across the country, and I've done, this has been a 5-year project of mine to partly to understand that. I've other drugs in the Black community, cocaine, sure. But in LA, for example, I could easily go down there and then there's neighborhoods all across Los Angeles where they're now we're, you know, to some slight degree, but not in, it's not a major
Yeah.
issue, not certainly like cocaine would be.
So I think that if you, so just look at, I'll just say different black communities across this nation, you'll see that it's not necessarily done alone. I'll just say that.
Okay.
And then the other point that I wanted to talk about was this sense of, I guess, pain.
Yeah.
I think we think about it differently because, again, just psychological, more of like kids going out to play or
Yeah.
being myself. Like New Hallville, Dixwell here, all black community, people are out and about. There's
Yes.
no issues that like people can go freely. That's not the thing. It's the neighborhoods are being totally ravaged by drugs and opiate use and cocaine use, mainly because lack of opportunity or resources.
Uh-huh.
And it's just really the reality of just being black in New Haven is terrible. You know, I don't have work. I cannot take care of my children.
Yeah.
It's scary for me to walk the streets, very high risk of police brutality. So
Sure.
there's a lot of psychological distress, right? The communities are there, you know, people feel that you do talk with your next door neighbor. Your kids can go out and play, et cetera, et cetera.
Yes.
But there is this reality of just existence, which is terrible, right? So there's
Right.
a lot of psychological distress.
Yes.
So I think we just have to be careful in thinking about the way that we create narratives for different types of people. It's not a one-size-fits-all.
No.
And I think that the media has done a terrible job at portraying or minimizing the voice of African Americans.
Uh-huh.
And it silences the fact that in certain places, certain states, 5 states, the opiate-related deaths for black people have increased and are far outweigh opiate-related deaths for whites.
Which
So-
states would those be?
Oh God, if you go to
How can you not know that?
Beckler, if you go to
Like, why do you
opioid,
keep challenging her? I don't understand this.
What?
This is really frustrating. You're challenging her, and you're asking
I'm
her to
not
come up
challenging her. I'm asking for backup.
yeah. So if you go to, there's Chicago Urban League, Beckler is the author, and she has the 5. One is DC, Illinois, Missouri, there's
Okay,
5, so
okay.
it's there. So, again, I just think that we have
Uh-huh.
to consider narratives and not realize that we can't just speak for one different group and not
Yes.
minimize, because I think that the media really has done a terrible job in forgetting.
In not,
Not recognizing
Uh-huh.
that there are different ethnic groups, American Indians, Black Americans,
Sure.
that it's a very different picture.
yeah,
And they've been suffering for a long time.
sure,
Yeah,
yeah,
so,
absolutely.
Yeah, that's all.
Okay. Yes, ma'am.
I run the Needle Exchange Program in New Haven.
Yes.
And I just want to support what she says. Majority of my patients are African American and Latino, and we also run the substance abuse program.
Uh-huh.
And I think it's about 85% minority.
Wow. Okay.
And most of the people, we try to get into a substance abuse treatment, but it
Uh-huh.
is, we go right into downtown, on the green,
Yeah.
Wow.
homeless shelters,
Okay.
Fairhaven, so it is true. And the overdose, some of the people who know the overdose rate, and there is a higher rate, very high rate of white overdose, right? Loretta? It's a white state. It's a white state. So a lot of them, and we give a lot of Narcan, and it's not to, some white, of course, but many overdose in the suburbs,
Yeah,
in the bedrooms, alone.
Alone.
That
Uh-huh.
population you were speaking of, yes, that exists in Connecticut as well, but in the communities, in the inner cities.
in New Haven, it's
Come
different.
with us to the green on the van.
Go to New
Okay.
Haven, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, different places.
Yes, Pittsburgh.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. Yes,
I wanted to confront you with your brilliance as a reporter.
uh-huh,
Because in the book, which is meticulously reported in terms of individual historical phenomena.
Right.
People coming from one town in Mexico and bringing a particular kind of heroin to a particular city. You know, it's just
Right.
a marvelous
Sure.
journalistic account of how things happen in their particularities. And yet, and you know, that's what we all love about the book. But here you're talking about a sort of a Jeremiah about the disintegration of society, and you know, it sounds, you're not talking about Robert Putnam and the decline of social capital, and we're all at home watching TV and on the internet, and oh my God, community is this. But so how do you think in terms of historical actors, which you documented meticulously in this, you know, terrific piece of incredible reporting, versus your kind of global social science, the culture is deteriorating? Those don't seem to be coming from the same perspective.
Well, you're right that I got into this to chart the beginnings of this epidemic as we know it today, right? And so I believe that involves people, personalities, and so you can find those people if you're lucky, and I was lucky to find a few of them. But I guess what got me on to thinking about these larger issues was the fact that I did not have any answer for, I did not have any easily available answer that suggested itself to why the one problem would exist in a town, Rust Belt town on the Ohio River called Portsmouth, Ohio, and in Charlotte, North Carolina, which is a banking center, which has got 2 new sports teams and a nice bunch of country clubs. I mean, the economic issue didn't hold true. And believing, based on a lot of the work that I'd done, that this was mainly a white issue. I'd seen it as a white issue from lots of people that I'd spoken to. So why? That's what made me start asking larger questions, and not of sociologists. Okay, not of people who's, you know, it was more like people who had been through, who lived this, and who were, and maybe who were in drug counseling, say, or there were drug counselors, or public health seemed to have a lot of interesting things to say. So it became more of my attempt to find, through the people I was talking to, I guess, and of course through my own experience. And it seemed to me that it was very, very difficult to avoid these larger things. They kept on hitting me, right? They kept on hitting me like, why would communities that seem to have all their problems resolved be involved in dope? This is what one cop told me. He couldn't understand it. It was like, no, there's no pain here. Why are these people, you know, that kind of thing. And I began to, oh yeah, you know what, that's true. What is the reason for that? And I mean, I as a reporter, I kind of my bias is towards believing that you can find answers from people who are not doing deep, in-depth research, that these folks will have thoughts and they'll be very, you know, on the mark thoughts. And so I think what I was trying to do was simply give some ideas that occurred to me. Others may have other ways of viewing this. But in my research, what came out of the conversations that I was continually having from all manner of people who were involved in this were some of those ideas that I enunciated and I talked about in the book to some degree. Is that all? I don't know. I'd be interested. I'm wide open to documentation. I'm wide open to facts. I try to, this book is the way it is because I allowed myself to be transported by facts and not, I thought it was going to just write the book about drug trafficking, as I said, and my book proposal doesn't have anything about a lot of this stuff I just talked about, none. I just thought this about, and then as I got into it, it became impossible to ignore that there were all these other factors. And again, why it only affects the white population, it seemed to me, or a majority white population. I think in some areas it may well. I'm fascinated by the idea. I will go back and try to find other in Los Angeles. I just have not seen it in Los Angeles. And in various other parts of the country, where it just seems our heroin beltway is Orange County. Okay, it's Simi Valley, Thousand Oaks, Agora Hills, Santa Clarita, all white communities, all Why is there? Why is that, and why so often is it not in the black community? I don't know. I haven't seen it. I definitely have not seen it in the Latino community. I spend lots and lots of time in the Latino community. It's just not there. So I'm always testing it. I'm always open to fact. I'm always open to new sources of information. But my answer to you would be that I tried to base it on what people I was encountering deeply in this, and from that grew certain ideas that I didn't think I could avoid. Yeah. Thank you all very, very much. I appreciate it. Thank you.